The coffee shop's front door slammed open so hard it rattled the windows, and Grace Morrison barely had time to look up before someone collided with her, sending her latte exploding across the floor in a spectacular arc of foam and espresso. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." The man's voice was breathless, panicked even, and when Grace finally looked up from her ruined shoes, she found herself staring into eyes she hadn't seen in 12 years. Felix. The name came out as barely more than a whisper. Felix Sullivan froze, his hand halfway to his wallet, his expression shifting from apologetic stranger to something much more complicated. Recognition dawned across his features, followed by disbelief, then something that looked almost like joy. Grace Morrison. No way. They stood there for a moment, oblivious to the barista huffing impatiently and the growing puddle of coffee between them, just staring at each other like they'd both seen a ghost. Felix looked different. His sandy hair was shorter, styled professionally instead of the unruly mop she remembered from their teenage years. He'd filled out, his shoulders broader, his jaw sharper. But those hazel eyes were exactly the same, still holding that intensity she'd never quite been able to forget. "You just dumped coffee all over me," Grace said, but she was smiling despite herself. "Right. Yes, sorry." Felix seemed to shake himself out of his stupor and immediately turned to the barista. "2 lattes, please. No, make that 3, and whatever she was having." He gestured at Grace, then looked down at the mess on the floor. "I'll cover the cleaning, too." "I was having a latte," Grace said, still processing the fact that Felix Sullivan was standing in front of her in a coffee shop in downtown Seattle, when the last time she'd seen him was at Camp Pinewood in the mountains of Vermont, the summer before their senior year of high school. "Then 3 lattes." Felix handed over his card without even looking at the price, and Grace noticed the black American Express card, the expensive watch on his wrist, the perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. They moved to a table by the window while they waited for fresh drinks, both of them awkward in a way that felt simultaneously foreign and familiar. Grace remembered being completely comfortable with Felix once upon a time, back when they'd spent entire summers together, swimming in the lake and sneaking out of their cabins after curfew to stargaze. "So," Felix said, leaning back in his chair and studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read, "what are the odds? In a city of 4 million people, pretty astronomical." Grace tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, suddenly self-conscious. She was wearing her work clothes, a simple blue dress and cardigan, practical flats now stained with coffee, nothing impressive. "What are you even doing in Seattle? Last I heard you were in New York." Something flickered across Felix's face. "You kept tabs on me, small town, people talk." "My mom still lives in Millbrook and your parents are still there too." Grace shrugged, trying to appear casual. The truth was, she'd asked about Felix more than once over the years, curious about what had become of her summer camp best friend. "Right." Felix accepted his coffee from the barista who'd brought it over, along with Grace's replacement latte. "I moved to Seattle about 6 months ago, opened an office here." "An office?" "I started a manufacturing company, industrial equipment mostly. Started small about 8 years ago, and it kind of took off." Felix said it like it was nothing, like he was discussing the weather, but Grace could read between the lines. People didn't carry black American Express cards and wear watches like that because their businesses kind of took off. "Felix, that's amazing." And it was. The Felix she remembered had been brilliant, always tinkering with things, taking apart gadgets just to see how they worked and putting them back together improved. It made sense that he'd gone into manufacturing. "I'm really happy for you. What about you? What brings you to Seattle?" Grace wrapped her hands around her cup, grateful for the warmth. "I moved here 5 years ago. I'm a veterinary technician at a clinic in Capitol Hill. It's not glamorous, but I love it. You always did love animals." Felix's smile was genuine, and Grace felt something warm unfold in her chest at the realization that he remembered. "Remember that summer you tried to rescue that baby raccoon, and it bit me, and I had to get a rabies shot?" Grace laughed, the memory suddenly vivid. "You're the one who convinced me it was a good idea. I provided moral support. The actual rescuing was all you." Felix was still smiling, but there was something else in his eyes now, something wistful. "I've thought about those summers a lot. Camp Pinewood." Grace had too, more often than she cared to admit. 6 summers they'd spent together, from when they were 12 until that last summer at 17. They'd been inseparable, the kind of friends who understood each other without needing to explain. She'd had a crush on him by the end, though she'd never admitted it. And then summer had ended, and they'd gone their separate ways. Different colleges, different lives. They'd exchanged emails for a few months, but eventually those had tapered off too. Life had gotten in the way. "Why didn't you ever come back?" The question came out before Grace could stop it. "That last summer you said you'd come back as a counselor, but you never did." Felix's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "Life happened. College applications. My dad got sick that next year. It was complicated. I'm sorry about your dad." Grace remembered Felix's father, a kind man who'd always encouraged Felix's inventive streak. "He pulled through. Took a while, but he's fine now." Felix paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "Did you go back to camp one more summer?" "As a counselor, but it wasn't the same without you there." Grace hadn't meant to say that last part, but it was true. She'd spent that entire summer feeling like something was missing. They talked for another hour, the conversation flowing easier as they fell back into old rhythms. Felix told her about his business, how he'd started it with a loan and a lot of naive confidence, working 18-hour days in a garage until he'd landed his first major contract. Grace talked about veterinary school, about her decision to become a technician instead of a full veterinarian, about the clinic where she worked and the animals she helped care for. "I should probably get going," Grace said finally, glancing at her phone. "I have a shift in an hour." "Right." "Of course." Felix stood when she did, and for a moment they just looked at each other. "Grace, can I get your number? I'd really like to catch up more. Maybe grab dinner sometime." "Yeah, I'd like that." Grace pulled out her phone and they exchanged numbers, both of them smiling like idiots. As Grace walked to the bus stop, she couldn't stop replaying the encounter in her head. Felix Sullivan, after all these years. And he wanted to have dinner with her. She was still smiling when she got to work. The dinner invitation came 3 days later via text. Felix suggested a restaurant Grace had heard of but never been to, the kind of place that required reservations weeks in advance. She almost said no, feeling out of her depth, but curiosity won out, and maybe something more than curiosity. The restaurant was elegant in an understated way, all dim lighting and soft music. Grace had agonized over what to wear, finally settling on a simple black dress that was nicer than anything she typically wore, but hopefully not trying too hard. Felix was already there when she arrived, standing immediately when he saw her. "You look beautiful," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made Grace's cheeks warm. "You clean up pretty well yourself." Felix was wearing dark slacks and a button-down shirt, no tie, the top button undone. Casual but polished. Very different from the teenager in cargo shorts and camp t-shirts she remembered. They ordered wine, appetizers, and then Grace found herself telling Felix about her life in a way she hadn't told anyone in a long time. About her apartment in Fremont, small but cozy with a view of the canal. About her co-workers at the clinic, the rotating cast of pets they treated, the satisfaction of helping an animal recover from illness or injury. About her small circle of friends, her weekly video calls with her mother back in Vermont, her quiet but content life. Felix listened with an attention that felt rare in Grace's experience. He asked questions, laughed at her stories, seemed genuinely interested in every detail. When it was his turn, he talked about his company, Sullivan Manufacturing, with a passion that reminded Grace of the boy who used to stay up late sketching out inventions by flashlight. It started with a hydraulic press design, Felix explained, leaning forward slightly. I was working for this company in New York, and they kept having efficiency problems with their equipment. I knew I could design something better, so I did, on my own time. When I showed it to my boss, he told me it would never work. So I quit, took out a loan, and built a prototype in my parents' garage. That's incredibly brave. Grace meant it. She couldn't imagine taking that kind of risk, or incredibly stupid. Felix grinned. But it worked. The press worked better than anyone expected, and I got my first contract within 6 months. Then another. Then 10 more. Now we manufacture equipment for factories all over the country. We've got 150 employees across 3 facilities. Felix, that's not just successful. That's extraordinary. Something shifted in Felix's expression, becoming more serious. It's been all-consuming. Building the business, I mean. I haven't had much time for anything else. Relationships, friendships. I missed a lot. Grace heard the regret in his voice and understood it. But you built something incredible. That matters. Does it? Felix's eyes met hers, and Grace felt her breath catch at the intensity there. Sometimes I wonder if I prioritized the wrong things, missed out on what actually matters. Before Grace could respond, the waiter arrived with their entrees, and the moment passed. But something had shifted between them, the air charged with an undercurrent Grace couldn't quite name. They talked through dinner, through dessert, through coffee. The restaurant began to empty around them, but neither seemed ready to leave. Finally, reluctantly, they paid the check, Felix insisting despite Grace's protests, and walked outside into the cool Seattle evening. "Can I drive you home?" Felix asked. "I took the bus." "Then definitely let me drive you home." Felix led her to a sleek black car that Grace suspected cost more than she made in several years. But he opened the door for her with the same easy courtesy he'd always had, and somehow that made her feel less out of place. The drive to Fremont was quiet, comfortable. Felix navigated the streets with confidence, and Grace found herself watching him in the dim light of passing street lamps, noting the familiar and unfamiliar in equal measure. When they pulled up in front of her building, neither of them moved immediately. "I had a really good time tonight," Grace said softly. "So did I." Felix turned to face her, his expression earnest. "Grace, can I be honest with you?" "Of course." "Running into you the other day, it felt like fate or something equally ridiculous. I've thought about you over the years. Wondered what you were doing, if you were happy, if you ever thought about those summers." Grace's heart was beating faster now. "I did. Think about them, I mean, about you." "I regret losing touch." Felix's hand was resting on the center console, close enough that Grace could feel the warmth radiating from it. "I regret a lot of things from back then, actually. Things I was too stupid or scared to say." "Like what?" For a long moment, Felix just looked at her, and Grace felt like she was 17 again, sitting by the lake, wondering if Felix felt even a fraction of what she felt. Then he smiled, but it was tinged with something sad. "It's late. I should let you go." Grace felt disappointment wash over her, sharp and surprising in its intensity. But she nodded, reaching for the door handle. "Thank you for dinner, and for the ride." "Grace," she paused, looking back. "Can I see you again, soon? I'd like that." Felix called the next day, and the next. They fell into a pattern over the following weeks, meeting for coffee, for meals, for walks along the waterfront. Grace learned about Felix's life in New York before Seattle, about the stress and pressure of those early years building his business, about the loneliness of success. Felix learned about Grace's daily routines, about the German Shepherd mix at the clinic who'd been recovering from surgery and had stolen her heart, about her love of cooking and her terrible habit of adopting plants she couldn't keep alive. It felt easy, natural, like slipping back into a favorite sweater. But there was something else too, a tension that hadn't existed when they were kids. The way Felix's hand would linger when he helped her into her jacket. The way Grace found herself leaning closer when Felix spoke. The charged moments when their eyes met and held just a beat too long. They were having dinner at Felix's apartment when things finally came to a head. Felix had insisted on cooking, and Grace had been surprised to find he was actually good at it. The apartment itself was stunning, a modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Puget Sound, but somehow Felix had made it feel warm, lived in. There were books on the shelves, photographs on the walls, a well-worn armchair by the window that Grace could easily picture him reading in. "This is delicious," Grace said, savoring the pasta Felix had made. "When did you learn to cook?" "Necessity. I got tired of takeout after about year 2 of working 20-hour days." Felix refilled her wine glass. "My mom sent me her recipe book and I started experimenting. Turns out I like it. It's meditative." "I never would have pegged you as someone who finds cooking meditative." Grace smiled. "You were always so high energy. Remember when you tried to build that zip line between cabins? In my defense, it would have worked if the camp director hadn't shut it down." Felix's eyes were bright with laughter. "I had the physics all figured out." "You definitely did not have the physics all figured out. You would have sent someone straight into the lake." "Details." Felix waved his hand dismissively, and Grace laughed. This was what she loved about being with Felix. He made everything feel lighter, easier. Even the mundane details of her day became interesting when she was telling them to him. They moved to the living room after dinner, settling on the couch with fresh glasses of wine. The city lights sparkled below them, and Grace felt herself relaxing into the cushions, into the moment. Felix had put on music, something soft and jazzy, and the combination of the wine and the music and Felix's presence made Grace feel warm all over. "Can I ask you something?" Felix said after a while. He turned to face her, one arm draped along the back of the couch. "Sure." "Why didn't you ever get married?" "Sorry, that's intrusive. You don't have to answer." Grace considered the question. She'd been in relationships, a few serious ones even, but nothing that stuck. "I guess I never found the right person. I came close once, about 3 years ago. We were together for 2 years, and I thought maybe he was it. But then he got a job offer in Boston, and when it came down to it, neither of us was willing to uproot our life for the other. Which probably means it wasn't right." She paused. "What about you? You've been successful, you're smart, you're kind. I can't believe someone hasn't snatched you up." Felix's laugh was dry. "I've been married to my work. I dated in New York, but nothing serious. I was always too busy, always prioritizing the business. And maybe that was an excuse, I don't know. But the truth is, I was comparing everyone to something and they kept falling short." "Comparing them to what?" Felix's eyes met hers, and Grace felt her breath catch. "To a girl I knew when I was 17. To summers at camp and stargazing and feeling like someone understood me completely." The air between them felt electric. Grace's heart was pounding so hard she was sure Felix could hear it. "Felix." "I had the biggest crush on you that last summer," Felix said softly. "Did you know that?" Grace shook her head, not trusting her voice. I did. I was crazy about you. You were beautiful and funny and kind, and you made everything better just by being there. I wanted to tell you so many times, but I was terrified it would ruin our friendship. And then summer ended, and I thought maybe I'd tell you the next year, but then my dad got sick, and everything fell apart. By the time things settled down, too much time had passed. I convinced myself you'd moved on, forgotten about me. I never forgot about you, Grace whispered. Felix, I had a crush on you too. That whole last summer I was working up the courage to say something. Felix's expression was a mixture of wonder and regret. We were idiots, complete idiots. Grace, I need to tell you something else. Felix reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on the couch between them. Running into you again, it wasn't just lucky. It felt like a second chance, and I don't want to waste it. I don't want to be the scared 17-year-old who let you walk away. I'm 30 years old, and I've built a successful company, but none of it means anything compared to how I feel when I'm with you. How do you feel when you're with me? Grace's voice was barely audible. Like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Like everything I've been working toward was really just trying to find my way back to you. Felix's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. I'm in love with you. I think maybe I've been in love with you since we were kids, and I just didn't know how to say it. Tears pricked at Grace's eyes. I love you too. I think I've been waiting 12 years to hear you say that. Felix kissed her then, soft and gentle at first, then deeper as Grace responded. She wound her arms around his neck, and he pulled her closer, and it felt like coming home. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Felix rested his forehead against hers. Stay, he said. Please stay tonight. Grace did. The next morning, Grace woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and Felix's arm around her waist. For a moment, she just lay there, listening to his breathing, processing the fact that this was real. Felix Sullivan loved her. They'd finally said all the things they should have said 12 years ago. You're thinking too loud, Felix mumbled against her shoulder. I can hear your brain working from here. Grace laughed, turning to face him. Sorry, still processing. Process faster, I want to take you to breakfast. Felix kissed her nose, then her lips, then pulled back with a grin that made him look 17 again. There's this place that makes incredible pancakes. They spent the day together, and the next, and the next. Grace went home to shower and change and feed her cat, but she kept finding herself pulled back to Felix's apartment, to Felix himself. They couldn't seem to get enough of each other, making up for 12 years of lost time. 2 weeks into their relationship, Felix invited her to visit his manufacturing facility. Grace had been curious about his work, and Felix had seemed eager to show her. The facility was in an industrial area south of Seattle, a sprawling complex of warehouses and office space. Felix walked her through it all, introducing her to employees who clearly respected and liked him, showing her the equipment they built with obvious pride. This is incredible, Grace said, watching a massive press being assembled. Felix, you built all of this. With a lot of help. Felix slid an arm around her waist. But yeah, sometimes I still can't believe it's real. They had lunch in Felix's office, a surprisingly modest space given the size of the operation. There were blueprints on the walls, a desk covered in paperwork, a photo of Felix with an older couple Grace recognized as his parents. So the company is worth quite a bit, Grace asked, then immediately felt awkward. Sorry, that's too personal. You can ask me anything. Felix leaned back in his chair. We did about $40 million in revenue last year. After expenses and payroll, my personal take was around $5 million, give or take. Grace nearly choked on her sandwich. $5 million. Is that weird? I'm sorry. I know talking about money is uncomfortable. Felix, I make $48,000 a year. $5 million is incomprehensible to me. Grace set down her sandwich. You're not just successful, you're a millionaire, a multi-millionaire. Does that bother you? I don't know, should it? Felix moved around the desk, kneeling in front of Grace's chair so they were eye level. Grace, I don't care about the money, not really. It's nice, sure. It means I can be comfortable, help my parents, donate to causes I care about, but it doesn't define me. I'm still the same guy who built a terrible zip line at summer camp. Grace cupped his face in her hands. I know. I just want to make sure you know that I'm not with you because of the money. I didn't even know about the money until just now. I know that. Felix's smile was soft. That's part of why I love you. You see me, not the business or the bank account, just me. Grace kissed him, pouring everything she felt into it. When they broke apart, Felix was grinning. Does this mean you'll let me spoil you a little bit? Absolutely not, Grace. Okay, maybe a little bit. As their relationship deepened, Grace found herself navigating new territory. Dating a millionaire was strange in ways she hadn't anticipated. Felix was generous to a fault, constantly trying to pay for things, buy her gifts, upgrade her life in small ways. Grace had to set boundaries, explaining that she needed to maintain some independence, some sense that she was contributing equally even if their financial situations were vastly different. Felix, to his credit, understood. He backed off on the extravagant gestures, focusing instead on the things that actually mattered. He showed up at the clinic with coffee when Grace had early shifts. He learned her cat's favorite treats. He listened when she'd had a hard day and needed to vent. He made her laugh, challenged her thinking, supported her dreams. 3 months into their relationship, Felix asked Grace to move in with him. She'd been spending most of her time at his apartment anyway, going home only to check on her cat and water her dying plants. But the invitation felt significant, official. Are you sure? Grace asked. They were in Felix's kitchen, cooking dinner together, and the domesticity of the moment made her heart ache with how much she wanted this. I've never been more sure of anything. Felix turned from the stove, pulling Grace into his arms. I love waking up next to you. I love coming home to you. I want this to be our space, not just mine. I have a cat. I like cats, and a lot of dying plants. I'll water them. Felix kissed her forehead. Grace, I know it's fast. I know we've only been back in each other's lives for a few months, but I feel like I've known you forever. Like we're just picking up where we left off and building something new at the same time. Move in with me, please. Grace did. The transition was easier than Grace expected. Felix made room in his closet, in his drawers, in his life. Grace brought her cat, a temperamental tabby named Milo who took one look at the apartment and decided he owned it. She brought her books, her favorite kitchen utensils, a worn quilt her grandmother had made. Felix integrated everything without complaint, seeming genuinely happy to have her things mixed with his. Grace kept her job at the clinic, despite Felix's half-joking suggestions that she didn't have to work if she didn't want to. But Grace loved her work, and she wasn't about to give up her independence just because her boyfriend was wealthy. Felix respected that, even if he sometimes grumbled about her early morning shifts. They fell into rhythms. Weekend mornings were lazy, spent in bed or cooking elaborate breakfasts. Evenings were for cooking dinner together, watching movies, talking about their days. Felix traveled occasionally for work, and Grace always missed him fiercely, counting down the days until he returned. When he was home, they were rarely apart. 6 months after they'd run into each other in the coffee shop, Felix took Grace back to Vermont. They drove to Millbrook first, visiting both sets of parents. Grace's mother cried when she saw them together, pulling Grace aside to whisper that she'd always hoped they'd find their way back to each other. Felix's parents welcomed Grace with open arms, his mother hugging her tightly and telling her she was family. Then they drove to Camp Pinewood. The camp was closed for the season, but Felix had gotten permission from the director for them to visit. Walking through the grounds was surreal. So much was the same, the cabins weathered but standing, the lake sparkling in the afternoon sun, the trails winding into the woods. But they saw it through adult eyes now, smaller and more nostalgic than it had seemed when they were kids. "There's the dock where you pushed me in the lake," Grace said, pointing. "You started that water fight." Felix laced his fingers through hers as they walked. "I was just defending myself." "By throwing me in the lake," seemed like a proportional response at the time. They found the clearing where they used to stargaze, and Felix spread out a blanket he'd brought. They lay there as the sun set, watching the sky turn pink and gold and purple, then finally dark enough for stars. "I used to lie here and think about my future," Felix said softly. "Wonder what I'd do, where I'd go, but I never imagined anything as good as this, as us." Grace turned on her side to look at him, propping herself up on one elbow. "I never imagined finding you again. When I moved to Seattle, I thought I was starting a new chapter. I didn't realize I was really just circling back to where I belonged. With me, with you." Felix reached into his jacket pocket, and Grace's heart stopped. He pulled out a small velvet box, and suddenly Grace couldn't breathe. "I know it's fast," Felix said, opening the box to reveal a stunning ring, a diamond that caught the starlight and threw it back in brilliant facets. "I know we've only been together 6 months, but Grace, I've loved you for 12 years. I don't want to waste any more time. I want to build a life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life. I want to have a family with you, grow old with you, have adventures with you. Marry me, please." Tears were streaming down Grace's face. "Yes, of course, yes." Felix slipped the ring on her finger, then pulled her down for a kiss that tasted like joy and promise and coming home. When they finally broke apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time. "We're getting married," Grace said wonderingly. "We're getting married," Felix agreed. "And this time, I'm not letting you get away." They were married 6 months later in a ceremony that managed to be both elegant and intimate. They exchanged vows overlooking Puget Sound, with friends and family gathered around them. Grace wore a simple white dress that made her feel beautiful, and Felix wore a dark suit and an expression of such love that Grace felt it like a physical thing. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Felix kissed Grace like she was the most precious thing in the world. And as she kissed him back, Grace thought about the long, winding path that had brought them here. The summers at camp, the years apart, the chance encounter in a coffee shop that had brought them back together. "I love you," Felix whispered against her lips. "I love you too," Grace whispered back. "Always have, always will." The reception was a blur of congratulations and dancing and cake. Grace's mother cried again. Felix's father gave a toast about young love and second chances that had half the room in tears. Felix held Grace close as they danced their first dance as husband and wife, and Grace felt so full of happiness she thought she might burst. Later, much later, when the party had wound down and they were finally alone in the hotel suite Felix had booked, Felix pulled Grace into his arms and just held her. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For giving me a second chance. For loving me. For being patient while I figured out how to tell you everything I should have said 12 years ago." Felix kissed her hair. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life making you happy. I promise." "You already make me happy," Grace said. "You always have." They honeymooned in Italy. 2 weeks of wandering through ancient cities and eating incredible food, and falling more in love with each passing day. Felix was relaxed in a way Grace had rarely seen, all the stress and pressure of running his company left behind. They explored Rome and Florence and Venice, getting lost in winding streets and finding hidden trattorias, making love in their hotel rooms and laughing until their sides hurt. "We should just stay here," Grace said one evening. They were in a restaurant in a tiny village outside of Rome, eating the best pasta Grace had ever tasted and drinking wine that came from the vineyard next door. "Never go home." "Tempting," Felix said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "But we have a life to build back home." This is just the beginning. When they returned to Seattle, they settled into married life with surprising ease. Grace went back to work at the clinic, and Felix went back to running his company. But everything felt different now, better. They were building something together, a partnership that felt equal and strong despite their different worlds. A year into their marriage, Grace and Felix started talking about children. Grace had always wanted kids, and Felix admitted he'd been thinking about it more and more. They decided to start trying, both of them excited and terrified in equal measure. It took 6 months for Grace to get pregnant, and when she told Felix, he lifted her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. They told their families at Thanksgiving, presenting Grace's parents and Felix's parents with gifts that revealed the news. Both mothers cried, and both fathers looked suspiciously misty-eyed. The pregnancy was mostly easy, though Grace had terrible morning sickness for the first trimester. Felix was attentive to the point of being overbearing, constantly checking on her, bringing her crackers and ginger tea, reading every pregnancy book he could find. Grace found it endearing even when it was annoying. "I just want to make sure you're okay," Felix said when Grace gently told him to back off a little. "I know, and I love you for it, but I'm growing a human not made of glass." Grace took his hand and placed it on her belly, which was just starting to show. "We're both fine, I promise." Felix's expression softened. "I can't believe we're having a baby, our baby." "I know. It's terrifying and amazing all at once." They found out at 20 weeks that they were having a girl. Felix cried in the ultrasound room, holding Grace's hand and staring at the screen like it held the secrets of the universe. They started planning the nursery that night, Felix sketching out ideas while Grace looked at paint colors. "What do you think about naming her something from camp?" Felix suggested. "To honor where we met, like Pinewood." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Okay, maybe not Pinewood, but something from nature, something that reminds us of those summers." They eventually decided on Summer Rose, a name that felt perfect for the daughter of 2 people who'd fallen in love at summer camp. Felix's mother pointed out the irony of naming their daughter Summer when that was literally the season they'd met. But that only made Grace and Felix more certain it was right. Summer Rose Sullivan was born on a sunny morning in June, after 12 hours of labor that Felix coached Grace through with surprising calm. When the doctor placed their daughter in Grace's arms, both Grace and Felix wept. She was perfect, 7 pounds and 3 ounces of squirming, crying perfection. "Hi, Summer," Grace whispered, touching her daughter's tiny hand. "We've been waiting for you." Felix leaned in, kissing Grace's forehead and then Summer's. "She's beautiful, just like her mother." "She has your nose," Grace said, studying their daughter's face. "Poor kid." Grace laughed, exhausted and exhilarated and more in love than she'd thought possible. With Felix, with Summer, with the life they were building together. The first year of Summer's life was a blur of sleepless nights and endless joy. Felix took paternity leave, and they navigated new parenthood together, fumbling through diaper changes and feedings, and the 1,000 small challenges of caring for a newborn. Grace's mother came to help for a few weeks, and Felix's mother visited often, both grandmothers besotted with their granddaughter. Grace went back to work part-time when Summer was 4 months old. not quite ready to give up her career entirely, but wanting to be home as much as possible. The clinic was understanding, letting her adjust her schedule to accommodate her new life. Felix was flexible with his own schedule, working from home as much as he could, making sure he was present for all the important moments. Summer's first smile, her first laugh, her first time rolling over. Felix and Grace were there for all of it, documenting everything and marveling at how fast she was growing. By the time Summer was a year old, she was walking, babbling constantly, and had both her parents wrapped completely around her tiny finger. "We're in so much trouble," Felix said one evening. They were watching Summer toddle around the living room, her laughter filling the apartment as she chased after Milo, who was tolerating the attention with surprising patience. "Why's that?" Grace was curled up on the couch, exhausted but happy. "Because I can't say no to her. She's going to figure that out, and then we're doomed." Felix sat down next to Grace, pulling her into his arms. "But I don't care. She's perfect. You're perfect. This life is perfect." "It's pretty close," Grace agreed, tilting her head up for a kiss. When Summer was 2, Grace and Felix decided they wanted another child. The conversation happened naturally, both of them agreeing that they wanted Summer to have a sibling, wanted to expand their family while they were still relatively young. Grace got pregnant quickly this time, and they found out at 20 weeks that they were having a boy. "One of each," Felix said, his hand splayed across Grace's growing belly. "We're going to have one of each." They named him River Felix Sullivan, continuing the nature theme and giving him Felix's name as a middle name. River was born in March, during a late-season snowstorm that made getting to the hospital an adventure. He was bigger than Summer had been, 8 pounds even, with a shock of dark hair and his mother's gray eyes. "He looks like you," Felix told Grace, cradling their son with the confidence of someone who'd done this before. "Thank goodness one of them does," Grace joked, though she secretly loved that Summer looked so much like Felix. With 2 kids, life became even more chaotic. The apartment that had seemed so spacious suddenly felt cramped, and Felix started talking about buying a house. Grace was hesitant at first, loving their life in the city, but when Felix showed her a property in Ballard with a yard and room for the kids to grow, she couldn't help but fall in love with it. They moved when River was 6 months old, and the house quickly became home. Summer had her own room, painted in the soft pink she'd insisted on, and River had a nursery that overlooked the backyard. There was a kitchen big enough for Grace and Felix to cook together, a living room where they could spread out, and a garden where Grace finally managed to keep plants alive. Life settled into a beautiful rhythm. Grace reduced her hours at the clinic even more, wanting to be present for the kids' early years. Felix balanced running his company with being an involved father, coaching Summer's soccer team when she was old enough and teaching River to build things with blocks. Summer grew into a curious, energetic child who loved animals and asked a million questions about everything. River was quieter, more thoughtful, but with a stubborn streak that reminded Grace of Felix. They fought and played and loved each other fiercely, and Grace and Felix watched them grow with a mixture of pride and nostalgia for how fast time was passing. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Felix arranged for his parents to watch the kids for a weekend, and he took Grace back to Vermont. Back to Camp Pinewood. The camp was in full swing now, the summer season underway, kids everywhere engaged in activities. The director gave them a tour, and Grace and Felix walked through holding hands, watching counselors lead arts and crafts sessions and nature hikes, hearing the squeals of kids jumping off the dock into the lake. "You think we'll send Summer and River here someday?" Grace asked. They were standing by the lake, watching the sun set just like they had so many times when they were kids. Definitely, Felix said. Maybe they'll meet their future spouse here too. That would be pretty perfect. Grace leaned her head on Felix's shoulder. Thank you for bringing me back here. For this whole weekend. Thank you for saying yes in a coffee shop all those years ago, for giving me a second chance, for building this life with me. Felix turned Grace to face him, his hands on her shoulders. I know I've said it before, but I need you to know. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, not the company, not the money. You and Summer and River, this family we've built, that's what matters, that's everything. Grace kissed him, soft and sweet, tasting salt from the tears she didn't realize she was crying. I love you so much. I loved you when I was 17, and I love you now, and I'll love you when we're 80 and watching our grandkids jump off this dock. Grandkids, Felix raised an eyebrow. We're already planning for grandkids. We're going to have them someday. Probably a lot of them if Summer and River are anything like us. Felix laughed, pulling Grace close. Bring them on, the more the merrier. They stood there as the sun disappeared below the horizon, and the stars began to emerge. The same stars they'd watched when they were kids. The same stars they'd watched when Felix proposed. Grace thought about the path that had brought them here, all the twists and turns, the years apart and the chance encounter that had brought them back together. It hadn't always been easy. They'd had arguments about money, about work-life balance, about parenting styles. They'd navigated the challenges of blending their different worlds, of maintaining their individual identities while building something together. But through it all, they'd had this. This love, this connection, this fundamental understanding of each other that had been there since they were 12 years old. What are you thinking about? Felix asked softly. How lucky I am. How lucky we are. Grace looked up at him, at his familiar face lit by starlight. I almost didn't go to that coffee shop that morning. I was running late and debated skipping it. But something made me go, and you came crashing through the door and literally spilled coffee on me. Best mistake I ever made. Felix's smile was soft. Well, second best. The first was not telling you I loved you when we were 17, but I'm glad I got the chance to fix that one. Me too. They went home the next day, back to Seattle and their house and their kids and their beautiful, chaotic, perfect life. Summer launched herself at them when they walked in the door, talking a mile a minute about everything she and River had done with their grandparents. River toddled over more slowly, but with equal enthusiasm, his face lighting up when he saw his parents. Grace scooped River up while Felix caught Summer, and they stood there in the entryway of their home, the four of them together, and Grace felt a wave of gratitude so intense it took her breath away. This was everything she'd ever wanted. This family, this love, this life built with the boy from summer camp who'd grown into the man she'd loved all along. Years passed. Summer started school, then River. Felix's company continued to grow, but he was careful to maintain balance, to never let work consume him the way it had before Grace. Grace eventually went back to work full-time at the clinic, finding that she'd missed the rhythm of it, the satisfaction of helping animals and their owners. They took family trips to Disney World in Hawaii and back to Vermont every summer. They celebrated birthdays and holidays, hosted dinner parties, supported their kids through successes and failures. They grew older together, gray hairs appearing, laugh lines deepening, but the love between them only strengthening with time. When Summer was 12, the same age Grace had been when she first met Felix, Grace and Felix took her and River to Camp Pinewood for the first time. Summer was nervous but excited, clutching her duffel bag as they walked through the gates. River, at 10, was trying to appear braver than he felt. "You're going to love it here," Felix told them, his arm around Grace's waist as they watched their kids get oriented by their counselors. "Your mom and I met here. This place is special." "That's so embarrassing," Summer said, but she was smiling. "You'll understand someday," Grace said, hugging her daughter tight before letting her go join her cabin mates. They said goodbye to River too, and then it was just Grace and Felix standing by the entrance, watching their kids disappear into the same experience that had shaped their own lives. "They're going to be fine," Felix said, though Grace wasn't sure if he was reassuring her or himself. "I know. It's just hard to let them go. They're not going far, just building their own memories." Felix laced his fingers through Grace's. "Come on, let's walk around before we leave." They wandered the camp one more time, pointing out places and telling stories. The dock where Felix had pushed Grace in the lake. The clearing where they'd stargazed. The dining hall where they'd sat together every meal, even though technically boys and girls were supposed to sit separately. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd never met?" Grace asked. They were sitting by the lake, their feet dangling over the edge of the dock. "Every day," Felix admitted. "I wonder, and then I'm grateful I don't have to find out, because this is right, Grace. Us, our family, this life, it's exactly right." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder, watching the sunlight dance on the water. "Yeah, it really is." They picked Summer and River up at the end of the 2-week session, and both kids tumbled into the car full of stories and excitement, already begging to come back next summer. Grace and Felix exchanged knowing looks, remembering their own reactions after their first summers at camp. Summer and River went to Camp Pinewood every summer after that, and every summer, Grace and Felix dropped them off together, taking time to walk around and remember. The camp became part of their family tradition, a thread connecting past and present. When Summer was 17, the same age Grace had been during her last summer at camp, she came home with a shy smile and news about a boy she'd met. Grace and Felix listened to her talk about him, about how they'd been friends for years, but this summer something had changed, and Grace caught Felix's eye and saw her own emotions reflected there. Joy, nostalgia, a bittersweet ache for their own youth. "You like him?" Felix asked Summer. "I really do, Dad. He's smart and funny and kind. He reminds me a little of you, actually." Summer's cheeks were pink and Grace's heart squeezed. "Then I approve," Felix said solemnly, and Summer laughed. Later, after Summer had gone to bed and River was absorbed in a video game, Grace and Felix sat together on the back porch watching the stars. "She's growing up," Grace said. "I know, too fast." Felix pulled Grace closer. "But she's going to be okay. She's got a good head on her shoulders. Just like her mom, and your stubbornness. That too." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and Grace thought about everything they'd built, everything they'd been through. The years at camp, the years apart, the coffee shop collision that had changed everything. The proposal under the stars, the wedding, the birth of their children. All the small moments and big ones that had woven together to create this life. "I love you," Grace said softly. "I love you too," Felix replied, just as soft. "Always have, always will." And sitting there under the stars with the man she'd loved since she was 17, Grace Morrison Sullivan felt complete. The journey had been long and winding, full of detours and second chances, but it had brought her exactly where she belonged. Home.